to Dialogue Across Difference, an event series hosted by the Centre for the Study of Politics and Governance at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Join us as Centre Director Larry Jacobs and guests engage in conversations across the political and policy spectrum on issues of the day.
All right. Well, welcome to our most recent webinar in elections administration from the University of Minnesota, the Hubert H. Humphrey School of Public Affairs, which houses the Certificate of Elections Administration program. And we do these periodic webinars to discuss elections administration. And today we have an all-star of elections administration, Charles Stewart, who is a professor at MIT. Let me walk you through some of the aspects of the program and describe what we do and how we do it, and then I'll turn it over to Charles so that he can tell us about Metzel. Remember that you can do live transcripts of this presentation, and please do post questions in the Q&A. I will be looking at those throughout, so please don't wait until the end. Give us some questions as we go, and I'll be looking at them so that we can be all queued up for the questions at the end. Welcome anything you have to say about elections administration. Charles is going to be able to answer a lot of questions. The Certificate of Elections Administration program at the University of Minnesota. So that's a mouthful. Basically what that means is that we do this training program for people that want to be or are elections administrators and want to be more educated in the job that they do. We have been around since 2017, almost a decade at this point. We've had hundreds of people go through the classes that we teach, and dozens of people be placed in very important jobs in elections administration around the country. It's at the Humphrey School at the University of Minnesota, so one of the top programs in the nation. And it is 100% online, and it operates much like a semester course that you would take in person, but it sort of begins at the beginning of the semester and either ends in the middle or at the end of the semester. We do have a couple that also start in the middle of a semester, but it tracks the semester schedule. And you can be completely online. You can be across the country and never even go to Minnesota and be a participant in these classes. They are completely nonpartisan. The people that teach them, frankly, are not interested in partisan politics. We're just interested in making sure that elections run effectively. And it's really practically oriented. So it's oriented around how do you be a better elections professional? So the nuts and bolts of doing elections administration. And the classes are really instructive along those lines. They are taught by expert faculty. I'm going to sort of walk you through a couple of the upcoming classes, and you'll see some of the names of people that teach these classes, but we have pretty extraordinary faculty. The curriculum is it sort of meets the moment. I know that I'm teaching an election law class right now, and so a lot of what we're talking about are literally stripped from the headlines. So the president puts out a new executive order. We're talking about it almost the next week and doing a full week curriculum on it. We have an extensive network of people who are around the country working in elections professional jobs, and that can help with placement. And we have just a very strong record of basically anybody who gets through the program, gets the certificate, and wants to get a job in elections administration is going to have a lot of opportunities to do that, because frankly, there are not a lot of people who want to get into elections administration and come into those jobs with a certificate or training ahead of them, because that's not really the historical nature of elections administration. Most of people that enter elections administration are just really well-meaning public servants who applied for or were dragged into a job, and they become great elections administrators. So this is kind of a new format for getting people into elections administration. Upcoming classes, Jennifer Morell is teaching a summer class on the introduction to election security. So that's this summer. We also have a fall class with Jennifer Morell. She's teaching physical security. And then also this fall, Neil Kelly, the former Orange County Registrar of Voters, is teaching a survey of elections administration. Timothy Collins is teaching our strategic management of elections administration. And then Gina Roberts from Arizona is teaching our voter participation lecture. She's been doing that for a number of years and does a fantastic job for us. There's two ways that you can get involved in the CEA program. You can either seek a full certification. So this is you're signing up to take the classes that will get you to the full certification. Or if you just want to take a class, see what it's like, see if it's maybe something you want to do, you can start with just any class and take it as a non-degree seeking student and see if it's right for you. And we've had a number of people, I mean, like handfuls and handfuls of people who have taken that preliminary class and then decided to move on into the CEA program. So it's really a great way to get your toes in the pool. It's basically a 3-step process to apply. It's really easy. You fill out the application form, you submit a resume, and you write a quick personal statement about your plans for, elections administration. And that's where you apply right there at z.umn.edu/CEA program. The thing I always do before I try to remember all that is I do CEA HHH, and HHH stands for the Hubert H. Humphrey. If you put that into a Google search, it comes right up, CEA at HHH. So that's where you can learn more. We have these occasional sessions where we talk about the program. You can also sign up for one of those or just reach out directly to the program and we'll set up a one-on-one. Upcoming CEA webinar. So we're doing Charles today, but I want to tell you about the upcoming one, which is we're going to learn about international election observation with Roki Solomon, who has been doing this for years. He's been at the Carter Center and he's worked for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. He's been all over the world doing elections administration and has some amazing stories. And, some of them are very harrowing. So that's going to be a really special CEA webinar next month, or in 2 months, on June 16th. That's at 10 a.m. Central Time. On June 16th, that's a Tuesday. So please mark your calendar. Obviously, we'll send you an email about it, but if you get it on the calendar now, you can join us. All right, so let's talk to Charles Stewart, who's going to talk to us about how well does the elections administration work in the United States. So Charles has been I'm going to try to say this, the Keenan Sahin. Did I say that right? Keenan Sahin, Distinguished
Yes.
Professor of Political Science at MIT. Great. And I'll be a bit of a fanboy for a moment. Charles is a bit of a hero for me. This is irrelevant to your life, but long ago, I was a professor at the University of Minnesota. And I'm about to age you, Charles. But Charles was already a very established and very well-known professor of political science at the time. And I was a real fan of Charles's work, paid very close attention to it, used to teach it in my classes. And then I went off and did various other things and circled back into elections administration. And there's Charles. And so he and I have become colleagues and friends. And I have to tell you that each time I see him, I kind of think, oh, there's Charles. Because he really is quite a celebrity in both the academic world, but in elections administration. And I know he's going to tell us more about his institute, but Metzel is also quite a groundbreaker. It really is the leading institution in the country when it comes to academic research in elections administration. And I know there's some other institutions like ours, like the University of Minnesota, and also the University of California, San Diego, the Maryland University, and others that have really Reed College, which have really sown very important ground in this world. But really, Metzel is the leader and has been for a long time. So I'm really excited that he can come here and tell us all about it today. So, Charles, why don't I hand it to you? Again, feel free to post some questions in the Q&A, and we will catch those near the end of our presentation. So I'll hand it to you, Charles. Thank you.
Thanks, Judd. And wow, thanks for the really gracious introduction. And I always like to be reminded how long I've been in this profession and long enough to have been through various chapters in my professional life, and the same way that Judd has been through many other chapters in his professional life. So, you never know when you get launched in the world where you're going to end up being, but we all both ended up working in elections, and that's been an exciting trip for both of us. And it's great to connect up with Judd whenever I can. I'm really delighted to be talking with scores of local election officials, state election officials. I do a lot of work, do a lot of academic work, but really my happy place is talking with election officials and learning from them about, and learning from you about how elections actually operate across the country in its many and varied ways. It really enhances my scholarship. It allows me to communicate what I see on the field into academia, into legislatures, and all the other places that I operate around the country. And I'm always really amazed at the job that folks do at every level of election administration in this country. I'm a fanboy of election administrators. I'm going to have some slides and that I'm going to be showing. I don't know how, Judd, how y'all handle these things, but I'm more than happy to share the slides out at the end of today for folks who might want the slides. I assume they'll also be on the recording of the event. So let me get going here, and I'm going to demonstrate that despite the fact that we have been sharing slides and doing such things since the pandemic, I am still a neophyte in doing this, and I rarely get it right the first time. So give me just a second to fire up some slides, and I'm assuming that things look good and that Judd will correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, you nailed it. That looks great.
Great. Okay, so before talking about what was advertised as my talk, let me just say a few words about MEDSL, the MIT Election Data and Science Lab, that which Judd so graciously introduced here. If you go to elections.mit.edu, you can find all the things that we do. I don't know that I necessarily want to encourage people to go off and do some web searching and browsing during the seminar, but there it is. Feel free to go and take a look at what we do. Right now, our splash page does have information about the 2024 Elections Performance Index, which I'm going to dig into depth throughout this talk. If you go to our website, you will discover what we're about. And our website, our lab is really about supporting election science. And by election science, we really mean the application of scientific methods to the improvement of election administration. And this is both an academic field, and I see it as a field of practice among practitioners. The lab itself, we've been in existence for almost a decade now. We grew out of the Caltech MIT Voting Technology Project, which I'll say a few words about later on. That goes back to the Bush v. Gore days. And throughout all of these institutional manifestations of my work and that of colleagues, We've been what Medsel is today, which is first and foremost data-driven, scientific, and nonpartisan. And on the last point, and actually to draw all these things together, one of the things that I've learned in my years in studying election administration is that there are many ways of getting to a final outcome. And there are many different values that policymakers and others try to achieve in election administration. And sometimes we agree, sometimes we disagree. But at the end of the day, what we care the most about is that however we come down on policy and practice and what we're trying to achieve, my lab works to try to get there in the best way possible. So, and we do a ton of things. I will just emphasize a couple that you are highlighted on our website these days. First of all, we are in the midst of a large research project trying to improve the practice of voter registration and list maintenance. We have granted several $100,000 to research practitioner partnerships around the country to try to improve the practice of voter registration, list maintenance. We've also, in recent years, partnered with several universities, most notably the University of California, San Diego, to support research around communicating with voters to build trust in elections. And so we have information about those projects and many more on our website. The final thing I will say in terms of kind of watch this space is that our one of our activities that's going on behind the scenes at the moment, but will soon become public, is an effort to bring online resources that are intended to facilitate evidence-based improvement in election administration. A resource hub that will have papers, will have applications, will have just all sorts of resources around various aspects in election administration. We'll be starting the rollout. We're aiming for the end of May, beginning of June, emphasizing the trust research and trust resources, and also research and resources in in-person voting, in precincts and early voting. And so watch for those announcements in the next few weeks and months. So the topic of my discussion is how well does election administration in the U.S. work? The first question that subsidiary question we would ask is, well, how would we know the answer to that question? And I'm going to suggest that we would understand it through data. So this really is a talk that will eventually drill down into the Elections Performance Index, which is one effort to try to assess how well elections are being administered in the U.S. But the broader movement of which I'm a part is to try to take advantage of the fact that elections, just by their very nature, generate a ton of data. The public is generally interested in kind of one thing, that is who won an election. But there are other data that get thrown off by the administration of elections that if we capture it and know how to analyze it and marshal it, we can use to make elections better. Okay. So I'm going to start by kind of pulling back a bit and talk about the wonderful world of election data and some sources and how we can take just some general thoughts about how we can take the data generated through elections to try to improve elections. Then I'm going to focus on this one product that we've been publishing at Medsel for several years now, the Elections Performance Index, and talk about its background, talk about the website that has the data and the analysis on it. Lift up the hood a bit to show how we actually make the sausage, if you will, and then at the end of that discussion, talk a bit about what this project tells us about how elections have evolved in the United States over the last decade and a half. I will end the discussion by some reflections on this whole EPI project and how it also relates to other efforts to assess the performance of elections in the United States and worldwide. So, to dig in, let's talk about the wonderful world of elections and especially the wonderful world of election data. And to introduce the topic, I will make reference to my favorite designers. I'm a big fan of mid-century modern architecture and design, and the kind of leading lights of that era were Charles and Ray Eames, who were in the pantheon of this era. They designed houses, they designed furniture, they designed toys. If you go to the Museum of Science at MIT in Boston, you will see an exhibit they designed to show the principles of mathematics. They did all sorts of really interesting things in the mid 20th century. One of the things they did was they released an educational video, or actually film back in the days in the 1970s, called The Powers of 10. And I remember viewing this as in high school and in college. And the idea of The Powers of 10 is to illustrate, this mathematical concept of what happens when you add a zero to the end of a number. And they did so visually was by pretending like we were just a meter above somebody taking a nap in Lincoln Park in Chicago. And so this is 10 to the zero, I guess. And then we move out one order of magnitude from 1 meter to 10 meters, and we see a bit of the field. Out to 100 meters, we see the lake shore. 1,000 meters, we see even more of the lake shore, and we can keep going out to 100 million light years, 10 to 24 meters, to the edge of the Milky Way. And so we go by planets, we go by all sorts of things, and eventually we're this far out. And then they turn the lens back around, they go back to the 1 meter, and then they go into 10 centimeters, and they keep going into this fellow's hand until he gets into as far as an electron microscope could look at in the mid 1970s, where you can see electron shells jiggling around. Now, I raise this because this Powers of 10 video can help illustrate the fact that elections themselves take place at different levels of aggregation, if you will, different levels of management. We can understand elections at different levels. And not only can we understand elections at different levels, we can gather data at different levels, we can diagnose problems at different levels, and we can improve elections at different levels. So, to be kind of parallel to the Powers of 10 video, I point out that we can analyze everything from the voting machine itself, the tabulator, the ballot marking device, the ballot itself, all the way up to aggregating data at a national level. And so, for instance, at the voting machine, you all know, because most of the audience here are people who actually run elections, that that each of the tabulators that are used has an audit log. And that audit log itself records all sorts of information about every voting instance that occurred on that day, if it's an election day or during the period of early voting. And I've actually used these audit logs not only to understand problems that occur with the tabulators, but as a way to actually time how long it takes, for instance, to mark a ballot or to scan a ballot. And you can actually use this data to back out how long people actually waited in line to vote. So there's, obviously you can get election data tabulator by tabulator or BMD by BMD. And this data can be used to diagnose problems with the technology. So that's the machine level. We can then kind of zoom back a little bit, and we can aggregate tabulators, and we can aggregate all the technology within a precinct, and we can look at precincts. The best known data that comes out of precincts are the election returns, and these get reported. And a lot of people are interested in election returns at the precinct level. But you also know that there's other things that are recorded in precincts. For instance, there are ballot reports, as indicated here, a form from Virginia where at the end of the day, the election workers record things like how many ballots were given out, how many provisional ballots, how many ballots spoiled, all sorts of things that occurred in the precinct that can be used to manage election administration better moving forward. I have a screenshot here of a coding sheet that I used in league with, excuse me, Fairfax County, excuse me, getting excited, Fairfax County, Virginia, a decade ago, when they were interested in getting control over the length of lines in the polling places. And we sent observers into the polling places. Actually, no, I'm sorry, I'm lying. What was happening here is that Fairfax County integrated into their procedures a practice where somebody among the election workers would every hour record how many people were standing in line. And we used these observations then to get very precise measures about how long the lines were, and when lines did form, at what time they formed, and how long they took to resolve. Okay, so there's all sorts of data that is automatically generated at the precinct level or could be generated at the precinct level. Going back up another level of analysis, we have the county or the local jurisdiction if counties don't run elections. And this is where, for instance, we begin to encounter things like the EAC's Election Administration and Voting Survey, which I'll come back to in a bit, which records a bunch of data at the county level about election administration or election results by county. Again, everyone is interested in those election results. It's also the case that once we come up to the county level, we can begin to gain access to or take advantage of data from other sources that might help us understand better how elections are being administered. For instance, the Census Bureau, we can get a lot of demographic data that we can then link. People like me can then link to other county level data to try to kind of understand better what's going on. As an aside, by the way, the Census Bureau also releases a lot of this data at the voting tabulation district level to the degree that those overlap with precincts. So we can actually do that at the precinct level, but we can do it reliably at the county level. Moving up to the state level, right? So at the state level, we begin to get access to other data sources. Obviously, again, election results at the state level come out, but survey research is really good. There's a number of studies that are really good at asking voters questions about their experience when they voted on election day. The Cooperative Election Study is one academic example of this. A survey that I've been conducting since 2008, the Survey of the Performance of American Elections, is another example of this, and I'll come back to that. But the Census Bureau also has the Voting and Registration Supplement of the Current Population Survey, which gives us insight into the experience of voters at the state level. And then finally, we have national data. And again, election results get aggregated to the national data, but there are scholars around who are interested in comparing elections in the US with elections around the world. For instance, comparing turnout rates, asking experts in different countries to assess kind of the quality of elections in various places. So, different data sources, different perspective on elections. And moving on to talking about the EPI, I want to really highlight three data sources in particular that will come back to be used later on. And these three data sources, which I think actually are the kind of the gold standards most commonly used to understand elections at the state level, are first of all the Election Administration and Voting Survey, which I mentioned before, administered by the Election Assistance Commission, U.S. Election Assistance Commission. Many of you have probably filled out the questionnaires responding to the EVES. This is really kind of a census of activities related to voter registration, UACAVA, mail voting, in-person polling operations, provisional voting, voter participation, election technology at the county or local level, if you're like in New England, as I am, and we administer elections at the local level. Okay, around 600 different data points for every election jurisdiction about election administration locally. Really important tool. This goes back into the mid-aughts. It's gotten better over the years and more valuable over the years. And I would encourage y'all, again, after this webinar, during the webinar, to search on EVES Data Interactive, to go play with the data on the EAC's website. Another important data source that I've mentioned is the U.S. Census Bureau's current population survey. Every 2 years, they have something called the Voting and Registration Supplement. So the current population survey, CPS, is the survey the Census Bureau uses to calculate the unemployment rate among different other data as well. But every November of even numbered years, they go into the field and they ask a series, just a half dozen very simple questions about voting in that election. They don't ask people who they voted for, but they ask things like whether people are registered, how they registered, did they vote, what mode they used to vote, etc. Really valuable resource. I use this regularly to create a kind of time series of describing how Americans have voted over the last quarter century, in person on election day, by mail, in person early. That's where this data comes from. And for those of you who've seen the so-called snow globe graph, we can break this apart and we can show how states kind of fall into this mix of the three different modes. That comes from the Census Bureau data. And then finally, the survey of the performance of American elections, where we survey over 10,000 voters immediately after Election Day, asking them all sorts of questions about their experience when they voted. It's over 50 questions that are about their experience, about the attitudes about fraud and reform, whether they have various types of ID. We ask them questions about voter confidence at various levels and tons of demographics. And we can say all sorts of things about the experience, not only nationally, but state by state. So for instance, this is just one of the many, many graphs where we were able to measure the average confidence that all voters, Democrats and Republicans, had in their state election administration in the most recent federal elections over time. As you can imagine, a lot of interesting things in data like that. Okay, so that's data in general. Let me now turn my attention to the Elections Performance Index and a little bit of history there. The Elections Performance Index really takes its origin from the 2000 election and the problems that emerged in Florida, which really highlighted problems that were emerging nationwide. Congress passed HAVA, Help America Vote Act, and it also appropriated several $billions to improve election administration in the United States. In 2006, I wrote a paper that got some circulation, which asked the question, okay, we've spent all this money. How will we know that the money was well spent? Suggesting a kind of a quantitative way of assessing the efficacy of those billions of dollars that were invested in election administration. A sexier version of that question was posed by Heather Gerken, who used to be the dean of the law school at Yale, and now she's the president of the Ford Foundation, where she suggested that the way that we figure out how elections are getting better is by measuring elections in the state and creating something she called the Democracy Index that we can think about sort of like as a U.S. News and World Report assessment of all the states. We can rank them all, we can give them all scores, and we can figure out who's behind, who's ahead, and we can nudge states into becoming better. Now, the Pew Charitable Trust at the time was very active in election administration and improving it. And Pew took Gerken's book and assembled an advisory panel of election officials mostly and academics, including myself, who hammered on this issue for about 3 years. And we transmogrified the idea of Gerken, of a democracy index, into something called the Election Performance Index, which ended up being similar to, but not at all identical to, the original Gerken idea. The overall index that organization of the index that we hit upon was that we divided election administration into 3 fundamental parts: registering voters, voting, and then counting the votes. And we came to the conclusion, the advisory group came to the conclusion, that for each of these steps of voting, we needed to assess how convenient these things were and how much integrity or security was associated with each of these things. To measure, to try to fill this table with indicators, we came up with around 50 or so what we call candidate indicators, ways of measuring election administration in the US. We subjected those indicators to validity and reliability testing. We decided that we would prefer to measure outcomes over policies. We didn't kind of care how you got to a good outcome, as long as you got there. Making sure the data came from reliable sources, would be available in the future, was an actual measure of good election administration, could be understood by the public, and would be likely produced in the future in a high quality way. There's a book out there that talks about basically this process of really kind of acid testing measures of election performance, co-edited by Barry Burden and me, called The Measure of American Elections. And after this process, we came down with roughly almost 20 actual indicators. These indicators measure aspects of the electoral environment, like voter turnout and registration, electoral infrastructure and general administration, the administration of mail voting, and the administration of in-person voting. We can also kind of take those kind of topical groupings and we can group them into where we get the data. And you'll notice, and you'll notice that there's some data sources that I've talked about before. That the core of the data for the EPI are from the Election Administration and Voting Survey, which has a lot of data about election administration. The Survey of the Performance of American Elections has an estimate of wait times in every state. The Current Population Survey has measures of kind of problems that voters have when they go to vote. And then state election departments. We got a bunch of data from them about what's available online, other policies that they have, turnout rates, and those sorts of things. And so variety of data sources, but it's also kind of a curated set of data sources, high quality and reliable, and is turned out after a decade and a half have been continually produced. So let's talk about the EPI and the website if you were to go there. So here's another website to go to after this webinar, elections.mit.edu. If you go to the website, you will, this is what you'll see. One of the things that we emphasize here at Medsol is to use the EPI as kind of a honeypot to get people come to the site and actually to learn about election administration. So the first thing I would just point out is that on the website, we have blog posts and we have other materials that try to educate the public about election administration and what it takes to run good election administration. So there's that function on the website. There's also the About, and in the About, you'll particularly be able to look at our methodology document. And if you really want to, dive into how one does this sort of thing, we have an over 100-page long document that talks about all the indicators, the theory behind it, the practicalities behind it, etc. Knock yourself dead right reading this thing. I read it carefully. Not often enough, but it does bear reading if you really want to understand what's under the hood here. But you're probably interested in the kind of the moving parts here. So we have these 18 or so indicators. You can click there on the website, and you can find out about kind of general descriptions of the different indicators. You can click on a specific indicator, say in this case like voter turnout. It'll take you to a page that describes the data for a particular year. You can compare the states. You can go across different years. You can see what the national average is. You can see the states that are high performers, low performers on turnout. You can go back and you can click on a state, or if you're from DC, you'll have to pull down the menu, but anyway, you can click on a state and you can say pull up New Mexico and look at how New Mexico is performed on all those indicators. And there's just a bunch of things that you can scroll through. So you can dig into indicators, you can dig into states. Now, this is called the Elections Performance Index, and we do give a score from 0 to 100 of every state and every year. So how do we get that index? So let me just kind of dig in a little bit into how we index. What we do is we take every one of the indicators and we basically put every state and every year on a scale from 0 to 100. 0 being the worst performance that we've either observed or in theory you could observe, 100 being the best performance. And then for every indicator, every state, we place where a state is that particular year, 0 to 100. And then we add up and we take the average of all those scores. So to give you an example, here's how we develop the component for average wait time. So we have measures from surveys of the average wait times from 2008 to 2024 in a presidential year. The longest time ever recorded was an average of 61.5 minutes in 2008 by one state. The shortest time was basically a fraction of a minute by a state in 2020. So those are our anchors. The shortest time is the best and the longest time is the worst. We then rescale all these answers to between 0 and 100. Now, in the case of average wait time, a long wait time is bad and a short wait time is good. And so we end up for this having to flip it around just so that things line up. Low values are high scores and high values are low scores, that sort of thing. So if you go to a state like Minnesota, which had the highest average index score in 2024, when Minnesota gets an 89, that means Minnesota across those 18 scores on average was across all those, the average was 89. Okay. You can see all the scores by going to the ranks. There's a lot to be said about ranking states. I'm going to jump over that right now. One of the features I will point out, though, and this group may be interested in it, I call this the Judd Choate feature. If you disagree with Medsel about the choice of indicators, you can choose filter by indicator. You can look at all the indicators. You could decide, for instance, that you think that voter turnout doesn't belong in an index like this. You can then check off the box to take off voter turnout, and we recalculate the index. In this case, Minnesota falls a point and New Mexico rises up a couple of points. Okay, so all sorts of things you can do, you can play around. I want to kind of end here by talking about some kind of national trends. Back in 2008, the average value was a 62. And in 2004, the average value was almost 80. So we see every state, with one exception, has moved over this time in their score, and many have moved quite a bit. I'm not going to, I'd encourage you to look at kind of the two extremes by going to the website. One is DC, which has moved from the bottom of the heap in 2008 to close to the top in 2024. And you can see how their indicators have all shifted across that time. Or Minnesota, which was high in 2008, is high in 2004, and the kind of the features of election administration they had in 08 and 04. You can also see that Minnesota is high in almost every indicator, but it's kind of in the middle of the pack with respect to Uocava, which is why it's only an 89 and not a 92 or a 95. Okay, so lots of things to explore there. If we look across all the indicators and across time, the indicators that have moved the most have been due to bringing on online voter registration, ERIC membership, new post-election audits, and new website features. These are things that are really policy and can move a lot in a short period of time. The other features which are about election administration, things like provisional ballots, et cetera, that's harder to move in big numbers. Okay. Between 2020 and 2024, not big movements, not surprisingly. So let me really now conclude, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions and a bit of a discussion to kind of consider a broader question about whether the EPI and similar projects. And in considering where we go with a project like the EPI, the first thing I would note is that we're not the only group out there assessing states and the nation in terms of election administration. There are three major, I would say, alternatives to what the EPI does. One is the cost of voting in the United States index, which looks at laws related to things like registration deadlines, registration restrictions, et cetera. It's a policy-driven index that's oriented around rewarding states that make it easy to register and vote by their estimation. There's another major policy index sponsored by the Heritage Foundation called the Election Integrity Scorecard that does something similar, but in the area of security, voter ID, election administration practices, et cetera. Yet another way of doing things is the Electoral Integrity Project, which is based not on policies per se, but is based on elite surveys that ask experts across the US and around the world about their assessment about the fairness of elections in various places. So, these are, I would say, not what we do, and I have disagreements, but I also think these are all high quality projects that do things differently than we do, and I highlight them because not only are they high quality, but they articulate what they think a good election is, and they follow through on it. And I think it's interesting that you get in different places sometimes, given where you start. Maybe it shouldn't surprise us, but each of these kind of rate states and assess states in different ways. As far as the EPI is concerned, the one thing I would note is that while we aimed to judge convenience and integrity equally across all three areas of voting, I think it's fair to say that we're really heavy on assessing the convenience of voting. We're light on integrity measures, and we're light on assessing the counting, the accuracy of the count. So that's one criticism that you can levy at the EPI. The other thing is that there are some areas, and particularly in integrity, where we've really relied on policy rather than outcomes, and that's something that I'd like to remedy in the future. So just some final thoughts. One thing is really clear is the EPI kind of represents where we were in 2000 and where we wanted to go. And so I would say that if states are mostly way up there in terms of the ranking in 2024, it's because that most states have taken a reform path that was plotted out a decade and a half ago nationally. Other thing is that the EPI was intended to inform policy debate. My observation is that I think it's actually been taken to heart more by election officials, administrators, than policymakers. Looking forward, we might want to think about how something like the EPI could change, and if it did, how. Should some indicators be changed? Should some be added? What would a new elections performance index that was embraced by kind of a random selection of thoughtful election officials and academics? What would a new EPI look like in the current age, where we have things like artificial intelligence and security and a renewed concern with voter registration integrity? How would we put together an index? So I'm going to end right now. I talked a little longer than I wanted, but I think we have time for some questions. I'd encourage people to reach out to me by email. I'm C. Stewart III on all the socials, and I have a Substack, Playing with Election Data. So with that, we'll see what the questions will bring.
Great. Thank you, Charles. Really interesting stuff. And of course, the EPI has become very important to elections administrators at state level, and I know even at county and local level. So learning more about where it comes from and how you get the data and make sense of it is really quite helpful and informative. I'm going to I'll start with my own question, sort of a philosophical question. So I'll throw a hard one at you here. Given that every state has its own policies and practices, procedures, is it right to try to compare states, given that it's really hard to make two states comparable enough to be able to compare them? So I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sympathetic to that, but to give the alternative view, and I'll go back to kind of what gave rise to the EPI and to Heather's book, which I think is valuable, even if we didn't quite go down that path. And this came up in the aughts, when election administration became a national issue. And national taxpayer dollars were put to to making elections better. And so I think it's fair, when something like elections become a national issue, to ask what is common in elections and what can we agree on. And I think that's one of the reasons why the principle that we hit in the advisory group was to focus on outcomes and really to try to identify what we could get as a consensus of what would be a good election in terms of the outcome. And this group agreed that high turnout would be good. Fewer provisional ballots would be good. Fewer rejected mail ballots would be good. And those sorts of things. We also recognize that some of these things you would never get to zero, right? Because for various reasons, there always will be a few rejected mail ballots, and it will be a good thing to have some provisional ballots, et cetera. And so, we kind of, went back and forth about how to think about that. But nonetheless, thinking that, people with disabilities should be voting at the same rate with people without disabilities. And I think nationally we can, I've seen it happen. We can come to a conclusion about what we're trying to achieve. And that's why I think it's useful in this time, if we're thinking about the future of the EPI, to ask again, what are the outcomes that we as a nation think are important to encourage? And then take into account, don't judge states so much on how they get there, right? Because as you say, there's, we know, for instance, early in-person voting is very common in the South. Voting by mail is very common in the West. there's cultural and legal and administrative issues because of that. And we can be agnostic to the best way to vote if we can come to an agreement about what we want the outcomes to be. So.
Great. So we have a couple of different questions from our students. So people that have either that are current students or people that are graduating from our program. So kind of excited to give you some of those. First, Jacqueline Williams, who's a current student in our CEA program, is asking about the utility of using ERIC, given that ERIC has become sort of controversial, and sort of the other side of that coin is the use of SAVE, the SAVE database. Should that maybe become a criteria state that we should get credit for the fact that they're using the SAVE database?
Right, right. I'd say a couple of things about that. One is, my sense is, even talking to folks in the business even in states that have left ERIC does still seem to be the gold standard in terms of programs. And so I think we would still stand by that. I would also hold out the possibility that if we were judging kind of list maintenance quality, I can imagine coming up with other metrics like kind of robust kind of regional compacts that might come together. Because after all, for instance, we give you a positive vote if you require any sort of post-election tabulation audit. And we know that actually there's good ways of doing it and bad ways of doing it, but we give everybody a 100 if you do any sort of post-election tabulation audit. So it could be that you just need to be in a high-quality interstate matching program. Would be fine with that. The issue is how to get a really high-quality comprehensive matching program. That's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is what I would really like to do is that rather than judging on whether you're in ERIC, whether you're in another thing, whether you're using SAVE, can we come up with ways of measuring the states that are the most diligent in for instance, removing people who have died or, removing people from the rolls because they've moved? That to me would be really the holy grail within the EPI orbit, because that would be getting us closer to the policy outcome. And there's probably a lot of different ways of making sure you've removed dead people from the rolls, right? And we shouldn't care whether you're using NCOA or you're using the obituaries or you're kind of calling up everybody alive today. It's really, can you get it done? And however you get it done, that's what we really care about. So that's the direction I would prefer to go.
So another one of our students, Linda Lon, who actually is graduating with her CEA here in the next couple of weeks, she asked a question about funding for elections. I'm going to turn it a little bit and ask, is that something that can be incorporated into the API? How much the state or other programs support the administration of elections?
Yeah, so a couple of things about spending. First of all, spending again is kind of the classic input. So philosophically, I think it would be a big lift to add something about spending. But probably what's really limiting using spending as an input is the practicality of getting something comparable across the states. I've been in the business of advising funders and kind of writing about kind of where we should invest our research money in kind of learning about election administration. And the cost of elections is the white whale, I would say, of election science. There's such heterogeneity of who does what, how things are accounted for, et cetera. That I think, first of all, we just have to get our arms around just the whole public finance of election administration. And then we can then begin to assess what I think the first question would be is that how much is enough? But we don't even have the data yet to even assess how much is enough to answer that question, which is too bad. I think that puts election administration at a disadvantage with local and state funding authorities.
Yeah, it makes it impossible to make the case.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Charles. It's been an amazing presentation. Really appreciate your telling us about the EPI and the great work that MIT does now and that Pew did years ago to set it up. Let me tell you a little bit more about the CEA program. So, upcoming classes include a summer program, summer class with Jennifer Morrell on election security. She's also teaching a fall class on physical election security. And then Neil Kelly's doing the survey of elections administration. Tim Collins is doing the strategic management of elections administration. And then we're doing one on voter participation this fall too. That's Gina Roberts. So those classes are all queued up for you. If you want to take one of those or learn more about them, please reach out to the CEA program. Here's the way to contact us. There are two ways to participate, either by signing up for the full program. I was mentioning one of our students who's graduating with the full CEA in the next month. And then you can also just take an individual class, see if it's right for you and if you enjoy it. And here's how you sign up. And then our upcoming webinar, International Election Observation with Roki Sullivan. He's going to be here with us on Tuesday, June 16th. You should take a picture of that QR code and that'll get you to the sign up page and you can sign up for that. It's going to be at 10 a.m. Central Time on June 16th. Please do sign up. And here is the page where you can learn more information about the CEA program. Thank you so much again, Charles. We appreciate your time. Wonderful presentation. And for those of you that joined us today, thanks again for joining and participating so actively and providing all the comments and questions in the chat. We appreciate it. Thanks again. Take care.